the Civil War was a conflict between the North, which was called the Union, and the South, which was called the Confederacy, which broke out as a result of the institution of slavery. The Union won, and the war ended slavery. While this is pretty much true, those two sentences don't give us the complex understanding of the war that we need. In this video, I'm going to dive into what caused the war, how did the actual war play out, what was the ultimate result of the war, and how did the Civil War change America? Now, if you're an APUSH student, you probably know that the Civil War takes place in period 5 of the APUSH curriculum, which stretches from 1844 to 1877. In order to give you a better picture of the Civil War, I might have to spur out of that time frame. Let's get started. Prior to the Civil War, the U.S. had been growing and growing. Many Americans believed in this idea of manifest destiny, that America was destined by God to not only expand, but to spread the idea of democracy and capitalism throughout the entire continent. We've probably all seen that popular image of an angel kind of floating above the Western territory. That kind of shows us that the idea of manifest destiny was this religious idea to many people. Ever since Columbus reached the New World, it had been the purpose of many of the French, Spanish, and English travelers to convert the natives to Christianity. Manifest destiny had been shaped by the Puritan idea that America would be this city on a hill. So, in 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French. In the next 2 decades, America would seize the western section of Spanish America, expand into the west of Florida, and eventually Spain gave the U.S. the part of Florida in which they still had control of. The U.S. eventually received Texas, half of Oregon, the Pacific coast from Mexico, and the Gadsden Territory. You're probably thinking, wow, this is great. America is becoming the America we see today. So much new land. Well, while the fact that America was growing is great, it didn't come easily. Many political compromises had to be made in order to avoid conflict. Spoiler alert, it didn't avoid conflict. In 1820, Maine was admitted as a free state, while Missouri entered as a slave state. This was an attempt to preserve the balance of slave and free states. In addition, slavery was banned north of the 3630 line. However, this compromise would be declared unconstitutional in 1857 by the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, because Congress didn't have the power to prohibit slavery in this new territory. This decision strengthened the power of the federal government and the institution of slavery in America. Next came the Compromise of 1850. After California requested to enter the Union as a free state, questions over the balance of slave and free states arose once again. Henry Clay introduced a series of compromises in an attempt to prevent a crisis between the North and the South. First, the Fugitive Slave Act was amended. This act required runaway slaves to be returned to their owners, even if they had run away to free states. This legislation was brutally biased towards Southern slave owners, as it also denied slaves the right to a jury trial. A source of hope from this act was the Underground Railroad, which was at its peak during this time frame. Heading back to the Compromise of 1850, it also banned slave trade in D.C. and allowed California to enter as a free state. One of the most heated political compromises was known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Proposed by Senator Stephen Douglas, this bill would essentially repeal the Missouri Compromise by allowing the people living in the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory, both of which were above the 3630 latitude, to decide whether slavery would be permitted in those territories. The promise of popular sovereignty brought pro-slavery and anti-slavery folks into this territory in an effort to sway the elections. One particular abolitionist, known as John Brown, believed that it was God's will for him to destroy slavery. He caused violence to erupt and ended up killing some pro-slavery settlers. Pro-slavery men from Missouri flooded into the territory in an effort to sway the election as well. These violent men who threatened those against slavery became known as border ruffians. This became known as Bleeding Kansas, and it showed just how divided the nation was over slavery. This compromise was unable to solve any of the nation's issues, and it only brought us closer to the outbreak of the Civil War. Another step that America took towards the Civil War was the Dred Scott decision, which I briefly addressed while discussing the Missouri Compromise. Dred Scott, who had lived in a free state, moved back to Missouri, a slave state. Scott appealed to the Supreme Court, hoping to be granted his freedom. However, the court ruled that since Scott was black, he had no right to sue because he was not a citizen. The Chief Justice, Roger Taney, decided that African Americans were not intended to be included in the phrase, all men are created equal, that comes from the Declaration of Independence. The fact that the Supreme Court upheld slavery further split the North and South. 3 years later, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He was victorious in running on the Free Soil platform, a platform which opposed the extension of slavery. He won the election without the popular vote and without a single Southern electoral vote. His main goal while president would be to restore the Union. In his inaugural speech, he announced the only conflict the country would endure would be a conflict that the South provoked. He never made any statements regarding slavery in his campaign. In fact, in his inaugural address, he said, "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery." However, conflict would only escalate throughout his presidency, as Southern states continued to secede from the Union. In April of 1861, the first shots of the war were fired. Since supplies at Fort Sumter had been dwindling, Lincoln notified the governor of South Carolina that he would be sending provisions to the fort. He would send no troops, no arms, no threats, just supplies. Not wanting the South to appear as the aggressive side, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, ordered Major Anderson, who was part of the U.S. Army, to surrender the fort. However, Anderson refused, and the South opened fire on the fort, which lasted 34 hours. The Civil War had officially begun. One of the first major battles of the Civil War was the First Battle of Bull Run. Many journalists, congressmen, and interested citizens traveled to Manassas, Virginia, to watch this battle from a nearby hill. People were interested in the war because they thought that a few battles would clear things up and the war would be over fairly soon. Americans never predicted the war would last as long as it did. Lincoln ordered the Union volunteer troops to begin the offense, but Beauregard, a Confederate general, received notice of this and got his Confederate troops ready to march towards Manassas. As soon as the Union and Confederate troops met, the Confederate generals sent reinforcements and eventually broke the Union line. The Union troops retreated and ironically ran into the civilians who were watching from the nearby hilltop. Many individuals on both sides emerged as leaders, including Thomas Jackson, who earned the nickname Stonewall Jackson during this battle. The First Battle of Bull Run represented a Confederate victory. Another important battle, the Second Battle of Bull Run, was larger than the first in terms of casualties. Although the Union Army was much larger than the Confederate Army, the Confederate Army had better leadership and was much stronger. Lee recognized how crucial it was to attack the Union before their two armies could combine. Stonewall Jackson ordered an attack in hopes of drawing John Pope's Union Army into battle. Thinking he had trapped Jackson, Pope launched a series of attacks on Jackson and his troops. Confederate reinforcements were sent and were able to crush the Union Army. Lee and Jackson had rid Virginia of the Union Army and were able to end this battle in victory. If you've heard anything about any Civil War battles, you've probably heard of the Battle of Antietam. It is probably the most notorious battle of the Civil War due to the fact that it was the bloodiest single day in American history. Taking place in Sharpsburg, Maryland, this battle was a result of Lee's attempt to invade the North. Unlike some previous battles, the Union forces were actually twice the size of the Confederate forces, although McClellan was unaware of this at the time. Both sides met at a cornfield, began firing at each other, and within 8 hours, 15,000 men had died. At Sunken Road, Major General French's Union troops were able to successfully push the Confederate troops back. McClellan had prevented a Confederate victory on Union soil, and for that, he was proud. This Union victory enabled President Lincoln to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the Confederate States. After defeating forces under General Pemberton and several other Confederate generals, Ulysses S. Grant managed to surround and seal the city of Vicksburg in May of 1863. Although some Confederate forces had attempted to rescue Pemberton and his forces, who were trapped in Vicksburg, Pemberton surrendered on July 4th, and Grant had secured another Union victory at the Battle of Vicksburg. After celebrating a victory over the Union at Chancellorsville, Lee decided to use this as an opportunity to invade the North. Lee ordered Ewell to attack Cemetery Hill, but Ewell refused to follow his order, giving the Union Army more time to prepare. The fighting lasted several days and the casualties were extremely high, but the battle ultimately ended in a Union victory. Dedicating the National Cemetery of Gettysburg to the soldiers who had died during the battle, President Lincoln emphasized in his speech that became known as the Gettysburg Address that the soldiers did not die in vain. After General Sherman captured Atlanta in September of 1864, he led a 285-mile march of approximately 60,000 soldiers from Atlanta to Savannah. This march lasted from November 15th to December 21st of 1864 and became known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman and his soldiers brutally burned cities as they marched in an attempt to make civilians feel what the war felt like. It was an overall stupid idea, as it hurt both the South's infrastructure and the South's morale. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee formally surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant outlined the terms of surrender, and the Civil War was officially brought to an end. Just 5 days later, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in Fort Sumter. At the sound of the news, the country was set into shock and frenzy. It was truly a time of mourning, for Lincoln was a great man and a great president. The period of reconstructing the country, specifically the South, became known as Reconstruction. By this point, Americans were fed up with the violence and fed up with the chaos. They just wanted freedom and peace. But this was also sadly the period of retaliation against those things, with the KKK, Black Codes, things like that. Within a few years after the war had ended, African Americans started to see their rights expand with the passing of 3 Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment made slavery illegal in all 50 states of the U.S. It pretty much stretched the Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th Amendment gave citizenship to African Americans who were born in the U.S. and provided equal protection under the law for all Americans. The 15th Amendment guaranteed all men the right to vote, although literacy tests, poll tax, and Jim Crow laws would infringe on this right for the next 100 years, until passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The country endured many years of pain before the war, years of violence during the war, and will continue to face challenges for hundreds of years after this war. Although one thing is for sure, the Civil War was a crucial part of our nation's history. It ended slavery and expanded freedom and independence within our borders of this country. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something new. If you didn't, I hope you at least enjoyed the video and the really bad drawings. It was truly my pleasure to share my passion for history with you guys.